The repair hangar was alive with noise. The sound of plasma welders crackled in the air, the hiss of coolant lines echoed between the walls, and the steady hum of grav lifts moved broken ships into their bays. It was the kind of sound that never stopped, day or night. To most, it was chaos. To Tessa, it was music. She stood in the middle of it, wiping black grease from her hands onto a rag that was already too stained to save. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, sweat sticking to her forehead, but her eyes were alert, sharp, and alive. She loved this place. The hangar smelled of burnt metal and ozone, a smell that clung to her clothes no matter how many times she washed them. Some mechanics hated it. For her, it smelled like purpose. The hangar wasn't just a repair bay. It was a lifeline. Out, here on the far edge of the galaxy, ships came crawling back from patrols, battles, and long runs through dangerous space. Some arrived with hulls barely holding together, their plating scorched and melted. Others carried scars of energy blasts and missile strikes. The ships looked like wounded animals limping home, and this hangar was where they came to heal. Without mechanics, without grease-stained hands and stubborn hearts, none of these ships would ever fly again. Humans were still rare here. The Galactic Union had only allowed them into service within the last 2 decades. To many of the older species, humans were still a mystery, a reckless, emotional race that didn't always follow rules. Most of the crews didn't fully trust them yet. They were tolerated, sometimes respected, but rarely embraced. Tessa knew it every time she walked through the hangar. Alien eyes followed her. The tall Zekri, with their armored plates and glowing mandibles, usually worked in silence but glanced at her with suspicion. The Quariesh, four-armed and quick-fingered, always worked in pairs, never inviting her into their circles. The Sharon, who could slither into impossible crawl spaces, sometimes looked at her as though wondering why someone with such a big, clumsy body was even hired. Still, Tessa didn't let it break her spirit. She carried her tool belt like armor, every wrench and spanner in its place, every tool marked with scratches of use. She was young, but she worked twice as hard as anyone else, and she carried her pride in silence. If she couldn't earn trust, with words she would earn it with sweat. As she leaned over the side of a shuttle, tightening the last bolts of a patched coolant line, she felt the weight of her own journey. She remembered Earth, blue skies, forests, oceans. She remembered leaving all of it behind for a dream. Back home, people had called her foolish for chasing a life among the stars. But out here, every repair mattered. Every bolt tightened meant one less pilot dying in the void. And yet she couldn't shake the loneliness. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she proved herself, she still felt like the odd one out. The hangar was full of chatter in alien tongues, clicks, and hisses that didn't include her. Sometimes she caught laughter from across the bay and wondered if it was about her. She would grit her teeth, force herself to keep working, and pretend she didn't notice. Tonight was no different. A battle-worn Corvette had been dragged in, its hull covered in deep gashes. She had spent hours crawling under its belly, torch in hand, sealing wounds in the plating. Her hands ached, her back hurt, but she kept moving. She always kept moving. As she wiped her brow and climbed down from the scaffolding, the hangar lights flickered briefly. A shadow passed across her path. She turned and froze. Towering over her was a Zekri. Nearly 8 feet tall, its body was covered in heavy blackened plates scarred from battles long past. Its mandibles glowed faintly in the light, sharp and intimidating. The air around it seemed heavier, as if the creature carried the weight of something she couldn't see. Tessa's breath caught. She hadn't heard it approach. The Zekri moved silently for something so massive, and its presence was overwhelming. For a moment, she forgot the noise of the hangar, forgot the smell of grease and burning metal. There was only the alien, standing close enough that her own reflection glinted in its dark armor. Her fingers tightened nervously around the wrench she hadn't realized she was still holding. The hangar was big, but right now, it felt very small. The wrench slipped in Tessa's hand. She turned too fast, and the heavy tool pressed hard against something solid. Her heart jumped. She had bumped the wrench right into the plated chest of the towering Zekri. The alien made a low rumbling noise that vibrated in her chest. Its mandibles clicked, a sharp sound like metal on stone. For a terrifying moment, Tessa thought she had made a deadly mistake. Zekri were known for their tempers. A single strike from one of those massive arms could break her in half. Then the alien spoke. "Relax, human." The voice was deep, slow, like rocks grinding together. "I'm a mechanic." The mandibles twitched, and then it added, "But your tool is right against me." Tessa froze. Her face burned hot with embarrassment. Of all the things she could do in a galaxy full of dangers, stabbing her wrench into the chest of an 8-foot warrior mechanic was not on her list. She pulled the tool back quickly, nearly dropping it. Sorry, I didn't mean—" The words tumbled out in a rush. The Zekri tilted its head, studying her. Its many eyes reflected the hangar lights, glowing faintly like coals. "You do not fear me," it said slowly, almost like it was testing the thought. Tessa swallowed hard. Her legs trembled, but she stood her ground. "Should I?" she asked, though her voice cracked slightly. "Many would," the alien replied. It crouched down so that its heavy frame lowered closer to her level. The plates of its body groaned as it moved, scarred and dented from what had to be years of fighting. "Your kind knows us as soldiers, destroyers. We are made for war." Tessa looked at him, really looked. The scars across his armor weren't decorative. They weren't from accidents in the hangar. They were wounds from battles, from violence she couldn't even imagine. Yet here he was, standing in the grease and smoke of a repair bay, not on a battlefield. "Then why are you here?" she asked softly. "Why in a hangar, fixing ships?" The Zekri's eyes lowered for a moment, and his mandibles twitched in a way that wasn't threatening. It looked tired. "Because I am finished with breaking. I am tired of war." The honesty in his voice struck something inside Tessa. She thought of herself, of how she had left her home, of how everyone had doubted her. They said she was too small, too weak, too fragile to make it out here. But she had chosen to build, to repair, to keep others alive. And here, standing in front of her, was someone who had once lived only for destruction, but wanted the same thing now, to create, not destroy. For a long moment, neither spoke. Around them, the hangar kept buzzing with life. Aliens shouted across the bay, sparks flew from welding torches, and the sound of machinery filled the air. But between Tessa and the Zekri, there was only silence. Thick, heavy, but not hostile. Finally, Tessa found her voice. "I guess we're both out of place here," she said, trying to smile. The Zekri's mandibles clicked again. It might have been laughter, though it was hard to tell. "Perhaps," he said. "But we work. That is enough." Tessa let out a breath she didn't know she had been holding. Her grip on the wrench loosened, and she finally lowered it to her side. But just as the strange moment of understanding settled between them, a blaring alarm cut through the hangar. Red warning lights flashed across the walls, painting everything in harsh color. The foreman's voice thundered over the comms. "Emergency. Incoming crash. Clear the bay. Clear the bay." The ground shook as a Corvette smashed into the hangar floor, skidding across the deck in a storm of sparks and smoke. The hull was cracked, fire leaking from ruptured fuel lines. Through the cockpit glass, a pilot slammed weakly against the viewport, trapped. The crews shouted, scattering for safety. Tools clattered to the floor as workers rushed to the exits, but Tessa didn't move. Her eyes locked on the trapped pilot. Her heart pounded, her instincts screaming at her to run. But another voice shouted louder inside her. "If you don't help, he dies." Beside her, the Zekri turned his massive head toward the wreck. "Human," he rumbled. "The fire will take you if you go." Tessa's grip tightened on her wrench. She turned her gaze up to him, voice firm despite her shaking chest. "Then help me stop it." The hangar shook with alarms. Red lights blinked like angry eyes across the high ceiling. The smell of smoke filled the air as fire spread from the Corvette's broken hull. Crew members shouted in panic, some dragging hoses, others retreating, toward the exits. The noise was deafening. Tessa's heart raced. She had never been this close to disaster. Her training told her to step back, to wait for emergency crews. But the sight of the trapped pilot pounding on the cockpit glass tore that option away. His movements were growing weaker. He was running out of time. Beside her, the towering Zekri stood still, his heavy frame outlined in the flashing red light. His deep voice cut through the chaos. "Human, you are small. The flames will consume you before you reach him." Tessa turned her head sharply, eyes blazing with stubborn fire. "Then you'll have to make sure they don't." For a moment, the alien stared at her. His many eyes reflected the flickering flames. Then, slowly, his mandibles twitched, not in anger, but in something like approval. "Very well," he rumbled. "We work together." Without another word, Tessa ran forward. The heat was suffocating, washing over her in heavy waves. Her lungs burned as smoke clawed at her throat, but she kept moving. Korak, the Zekri, followed behind her, his long strides shaking the deck. Where she darted quick and low, he moved like a shield, pushing aside fallen panels and debris with terrifying strength. The Corvette groaned, metal twisting as fire licked at its fuel lines. Sparks rained down from above. "Cut the hatch," Tessa shouted. Korak slammed his claws into the edge of the pilot's canopy. His muscles bulged under scarred armor plates as he tore at the metal. Sparks flew as his strength fought against stubborn bolts. Tessa dropped beside him, pulling, her cutter torch from her belt. The flame hissed to life, blindingly bright as she pressed it to the seam. "Faster, human," Korak growled. "I'm trying." Tessa coughed, sweat stinging her eyes. Her hands shook, but she forced them steady. She could feel the heat rising, around her like a living thing, threatening to swallow her whole. The pilot inside pounded weakly again, his face pale through the glass. Tessa's stomach twisted. "Hold on. Please, just hold on." Korak's claws ripped another piece of the canopy free with a screech. Metal tore like paper in his hands, but as he moved, a burst of flame erupted from the ruptured fuel line beside them. The fire roared high, heat searing Tessa's skin. She screamed and dropped back, covering her face. In that instant, Korak moved. The alien threw his massive body between Tessa and the flame, shielding her with his armored frame. Fire washed over his back, blackening already scarred plates. The smell of burning chitin filled the air, harsh and sickening. "Korak!" Tessa gasped, eyes wide with horror. But the alien only growled. "Work, human. The pilot dies if you stop." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself up, crawling back toward the canopy. Her hands found the cutter again, even though they trembled violently. She pushed it against the final seam, sparks showering her arms. Her skin burned, but she refused to let go. Almost, she whispered through gritted teeth. With a final scream of tearing metal, the canopy broke loose. Korak grabbed the broken hatch and flung it aside with one arm. The pilot fell forward, coughing violently as air rushed in. Tessa reached in and caught his arm, dragging him out of the wreck. "Got you," she said, voice breaking with relief. The bay crews rushed forward now, pulling the pilot away, carrying him toward medics waiting at the far end. Cheers rose from the hangar floor. For a moment, the chaos stilled. The danger wasn't gone, but a life had been saved. Tessa collapsed to her knees, coughing hard as smoke burned her lungs. Her arms shook with exhaustion, the cutter torch slipping from her grip. She looked up through the haze and saw Korak standing tall, his back still, smoldering, smoke rising from blackened scars. He turned his gaze down at her. Slowly, he extended one massive clawed hand. His voice was lower this time, almost gentle. "You did not flee, human." Tessa looked at his hand, then up at his scarred face. She placed her small, grease-stained palm against his claw. He lifted, her easily, holding her steady as though she weighed nothing. Her voice cracked, but the words carried truth. "Neither did you." The hangar was thick with smoke. Sirens still wailed, though softer now, fading into the background as crews worked to put out the fire. Foam hissed over the broken Corvette, cooling the flames. The ship lay silent, scarred and blackened, but alive, just like the pilot who had been carried away by medics. Tessa leaned against a railing, chest heaving. Her lungs still burned with every breath. Her hands shook, the skin raw and reddened from the heat of the cutter torch. Sweat ran down her face, mixing with grease and ash. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest. But her eyes never left Korak. Zechary stood tall, though smoke still curled from his scorched back. His armor plates were cracked and blackened, his body carrying the cost of shielding her from the flames. Yet he didn't stumble. He didn't complain. He stood in silence as if pain was nothing new to him. For the first time, Tessa saw the hangar crew staring, not at her, but at them both. The aliens who had always whispered behind her back, who had doubted her, now looked with wide eyes. Shock, maybe respect, maybe something else. The foreman, a gruff Quaresh with 4 arms, marched toward them. His voice boomed across the hangar. "What were you thinking? Running into fire without clearance?" Tessa opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her throat was still raw from smoke. Korak answered for her, his deep voice like rolling thunder. "We were thinking of the pilot. He would be ash if we waited." The foreman froze at the boldness. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the Quaresh's many eyes softened, and he gave a small nod. "You saved him. Against all odds, you saved him." A murmur spread through the crew. Tessa felt heat rise in her cheeks, but it wasn't from the fire this time. For the first time since she arrived in this place, people weren't looking at her like an outsider. They were looking at her like one of them. Still, the weight of exhaustion pressed down. Her knees buckled and she stumbled. Before she could fall, a massive claw caught her arm. Korak steadied her, his grip surprisingly gentle. "Careful, human," he rumbled. She looked up at him, her vision blurred from smoke. His eyes, so many of them, glowing faintly in the dim light, didn't look frightening anymore. They looked steady, reliable. "You could have died," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "So could you," Korak replied simply. The words hit her like a hammer. He had risked his life for her without hesitation, shielding her with his own body. Not because he had to, but because in that moment, they were a team. Medics approached, offering oxygen masks and sprays for burns. Tessa waved them off, but they insisted. She let them cool her scorched skin, breathing deeply as fresh air filled her lungs. Korak accepted nothing. He stood silent, towering above them, watching the crews finish their work. "You should let them treat you," Tessa said, her voice still weak. Korak shook his head slowly. "Pain is familiar. It reminds me I live." There was something broken. In his words, a weight she couldn't name. Her chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't need to carry pain like armor, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. Instead, she whispered, "Well, thank you for saving me." Korak's mandibles clicked softly and his voice lowered to almost a whisper. "You saved me too, human. You did not see? When the fire struck, and I wanted to surrender to it, you pressed forward, your small hands. They reminded me why. I came to build, not destroy." Tessa's throat tightened, but she couldn't speak. The hangar noises faded. In that moment, it was just the two of them, 2 mechanics from 2 worlds bound by fire and survival. The crews eventually returned to work. Ships still needed repairs. The galaxy would not pause for one act of bravery. But something had changed. A new story now lingered in the hangar air. Tessa sat on the edge of a crate staring at her hands, burned, blackened with grease, but alive. Korak stood beside her, silent, a shadow taller than all the noise around them. For the first time, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like she belonged. And as she glanced at Korak, scarred but unbroken, she knew one truth. This was only the beginning. The hangar never truly slept. Even after the fire was contained and the pilot carried away, the bay was alive with movement. Crews shouted orders, Machines whined and sparks rained from welding torches. But for Tessa, the noise faded into the background. Her focus was on Korak. The alien stood a few feet away, silent as ever, arms crossed. His scorched armor plates were still cracked and blackened, but he showed no sign of weakness. He didn't ask for rest, didn't ask for help. He simply watched the wreck of the Corvette as if already planning how to fix it. Tessa's hands still trembled from exhaustion, but she stepped closer. "We can't leave her like this," she said quietly, looking at the ship. "She'll never fly again unless we start now." Korak's mandibles twitched. "You wish to work? After what you have endured?" Tessa gave a tired smile. "That pilot's alive. That means our job isn't finished. A ship is like its crew. If it's broken, they're broken. We fix both." For the first time, something that might have been approval flickered in Korak's many eyes. He gave a low rumble, almost like laughter, and nodded once. "Then we work, human." And so they did. The Corvette's belly was a mess of twisted metal and melted panels. Tessa slid beneath it with her torch and patch kit, crawling into spaces too small for others. The heat inside was stifling, but her small frame gave her an advantage. She called out for tools, her voice echoing in the hollow hull. "Hand me the spanner," she shouted. Without hesitation, a massive claw reached under the hull, placing the exact tool into her hand. His size made it seem impossible that he could manage such delicate tasks, but he never fumbled. Every time she asked, the right tool appeared, claws careful not to crush it. When bulkheads sagged dangerously, Korak braced them with his strength. When fires sparked to life again, Tessa rerouted coolant lines across his arm, hosing the flames down as he held steady. They moved as one, her speed and precision balancing his raw power. For the first time since she had joined the hangar, Tessa didn't feel like she was proving herself. She wasn't trying to outwork anyone, or silence whispers. She was simply part of something greater, a team. Sweat poured down her back as she welded new braces into place. Sparks flew across her arms, but she ignored the sting. She trusted that Korak was there, watching her back. And when a panel threatened to collapse on her, she didn't flinch. Because she knew his massive claws would catch it. Hours passed like minutes. Slowly, the broken Corvette began to look less like a corpse and more like a ship again. The hull was sealed, the fuel lines patched, the worst damage reinforced. The ship would need weeks of work before flying again, but tonight it had been saved from death. Tessa crawled out from beneath the belly, her body aching, hands blistered and blackened. She sat back on the deck, wiping sweat from her face with her sleeve. Across from her, Korak crouched low, his scarred plates covered in soot. His chest rose and fell heavily, but his eyes glowed steady. "You work like one who has fought battles," he said slowly. Tessa let out a tired laugh. "Only battles with broken engines." Korak tilted his head, studying her. "Do you know what it means to be trusted in fire?" She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" The Zekri's mandibles clicked softly. "In my people's tongue, there is no word for friend. There is only a word for those who share the flame, those who stand when death is near. You shared the flame." Her chest tightened at his words. She didn't know what to say. No one had ever said anything like that to her. All her life she had felt small, overlooked, out of place. But here was this giant warrior, scarred, feared, respected, telling her she was something more. "I guess that makes us partners," she whispered. Korak's gaze held hers for a long moment. Then, with surprising gentleness, he nodded. "Yes, partners." The hangar crew was watching again. But this time, Tessa didn't feel their stares like judgment. She felt them like witnesses. Something had changed tonight, not just for her, but for the alien beside her. Together, they had walked into fire. Together, they had come out alive. And together they would build again. The hangar was quieter now, but the silence was heavy. Smoke still hung in the air, drifting like ghosts across the floor. Foam hissed as it ate at the last glowing embers. The wrecked corvette lay beaten but safe, her fires extinguished, her pilot saved. Tessa sat slumped on the cold deck, her back against a crate. Her body ached as if every muscle had been pulled apart. Her hands were blistered, her arms streaked, with burns. The taste of smoke clung to her throat, making each breath painful. She tried to stand, but her legs wobbled and gave way. She fell back down, gasping. Before she could try again, a shadow fell across her. Korak. The Zekri towered above her, his form scarred and blackened by fire. His armor plates were cracked and smoking, yet he stood unbowed. His many eyes glowed, faintly, steady even through the haze. In one hand he held a bent panel he had torn away from the corvette. He dropped it aside with a clang and turned his gaze toward her. Slowly he extended one massive claw. Tessa stared at it, too exhausted to speak. His hand was huge, clawed and deadly, but it hovered close like an anchor, offering not command, but support. She lifted her trembling hand, her fingers so small against his. He pulled her up with ease, steadying her on her feet. "You did not flee," he said, his deep voice carrying through the smoky air. Her throat tightened. She wanted to laugh, to cry, to scream at the absurdity of it all, but only one whisper came out. "Neither did you." They stood together, both scarred by the fire but alive. For a long moment they didn't move, didn't speak. Around them the hangar crew began to gather, whispers spreading like ripples. That human. She went into the flames. And the Zekri, he shielded her. They saved him. Together. Tessa felt their eyes on her, but for once she didn't shrink under the weight. She stood straighter, shoulders squared even though her legs still trembled. A medic approached with a mask of clean oxygen. "You need this," he insisted, pressing it toward her face. Tessa tried to wave him away, but Korak rumbled. She breathed smoke. Let her heal. For once she didn't argue. She let the medic place the mask over her mouth and cool air rushed into her lungs. Relief flooded her chest, her body shaking as it finally relaxed. Korak, however, refused treatment. Medics tried to spray his scorched plates with healing foam, but he lifted one claw, stopping them. "No," he said firmly. "Scars remind me." Tessa pulled the mask away briefly, her voice raw. "Remind you of what?" Korak's mandibles clicked softly, and his many eyes lowered. "Of who I was, of what I must never return to." The weight in his words made her chest ache. He wasn't just carrying the scars of the fire tonight, he carried the scars of his past. A life of war, a life of destruction. And yet here he was, saving lives, building instead of breaking. She reached out without thinking and touched his arm. The surface was rough and burned, hot under her fingers, but she didn't pull away. "You're not that anymore," she whispered. For a moment, Korak didn't move. Then his head lowered slightly, as if her words had pierced through armor no fire could touch. The foreman stepped forward, his voice carrying over the gathered crew. "What you two did was madness." He paused, his many eyes scanning the hangar. "But it saved a life. And in this place, that is what matters most." The crew murmured in agreement. For once, no one looked at Tessa with doubt or suspicion. They looked at her with respect. And they looked at Korak not as a monster, but as a comrade. Tessa's chest swelled, though tears stung her eyes. All her life, she had fought to belong. Tonight, in the fire and smoke, she had found it. Not alone, but with someone who understood what it meant to be an outsider. Korak turned his gaze to her again. "In my people's tongue," he said slowly, "we do not say friend, we say fire brother or fire sister. It means one who shares the flames and survives." Her lips trembled into a small smile. "Then I guess I'm your fire sister." His mandibles twitched, and for the first time she realized he was smiling back. Together, under the broken light of the hangar, Scarred and exhausted, they stood side by side. Not human, not Zekri, just two mechanics. Partners. Survivors. And somewhere in the smoky silence, a new story was already being born. The hangar returned to its rhythm in the days that followed, but it was not the same. The crash had been contained, the pilot healed, in the infirmary, and the damaged Corvette rested in its bay like a patient under care. Yet whispers still moved through the hangar, carried on every shift in every corner. They spoke of the human who had run into the fire. They spoke of the Zekri who had shielded her with his own body. Most of all, they spoke of how the two had moved together, as if the flame itself had chosen them to stand side by side. Tessa felt the change in the air. No longer did she catch suspicious glances or mocking laughter. The Sharon no longer muttered when she passed. The Quaresh, with all their four-armed pride, sometimes asked her for tools. Even the foreman, who had once doubted her worth, gave a small nod whenever their eyes met. She had not only saved a life that night, she had earned a place. But, more than the crew, it was Korak who stayed in her thoughts. Every day since, he worked silently at her side. He lifted panels she couldn't budge, held steady bulkheads when her arms gave out, and passed her tools with the same care as before. He didn't speak often, but when he did, his words carried weight. And when his eyes found hers across a cloud of sparks or steam, there was always the unspoken truth between them. We shared the fire. One evening, long after most of the crew had left, Tessa lingered in the hangar. She sat on the edge of a crate, polishing the same wrench she had once pressed into Korak's chest by mistake. The tool was scratched and worn, but to her, it had become more than metal. It was the beginning of everything. She heard heavy steps behind her. Korak approached, his shadow stretching long across the deck. He lowered himself slowly, crouching so his massive form didn't loom so high. "You are still here," he said in his deep, rumbling voice. "Couldn't sleep," Tessa admitted, twirling the wrench in her hands. "Too much on my mind." Korak tilted his head. "The fire?" She shook her head softly. "No, the future." She looked at him, her voice quieter now. "I never thought I'd belong here. I thought I'd always be the outsider, the human mechanic no one wanted. But that night, everything changed." Korak studied her for a long moment, mandibles twitching. "You proved yourself. Not to them. To yourself." The words sank deep, heavier than any compliment she had ever received. She blinked quickly, fighting back tears. "And you?" she asked. "What did that night mean for you?" For the first time, Korak's eyes lowered, not in shame but in reflection. "I remembered I am more than war. For years I thought I was nothing without battle, but when I stood with you in the fire, I felt purpose again. To protect, to build, to be more." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was warm, steady, like the calm after a storm. Finally, Tessa lifted the wrench and tapped it lightly against his arm. "Guess we make a pretty good team." His mandibles clicked softly. "Better than war." They both laughed then, hers light, his deep and strange, but real. The sound echoed through the hangar, carrying into the high rafters where only silence usually lived. Later, as they walked out together, the other mechanics glanced their way, but no one whispered. No one doubted. Instead, some lifted their mugs, some tapped their tools against metal, and some simply nodded. Respect in its purest form